April 1944. The clatter of steel wheels on tracks echoed across the plains of Oklahoma. A trainload of captured German soldiers, wrists raw from hours of iron cuffs, pressed their faces to the barred windows. Dust rose in clouds as brakes hissed. Beyond the wire fences, instead of ruined barracks or skeletal watchtowers, they glimpsed neat rows of wooden huts, whitewashed, with small gardens carved out of the earth. The men shifted nervously. One muttered, "Dies ist Amerika. This is America." His comrade only gripped his greatcoat tighter. Boots struck gravel when the guards shouted the order. Step by step, the prisoners shuffled off. They expected jeering crowds, fists, maybe hunger as punishment. Their officers had told them that capture by Americans meant humiliation and starvation. Yet the first thing they smelled was bread. The warm scent drifted from a mess hall chimney, mingling with the sharp tang of creosote from fresh timber. The contradiction cut through the tension like a knife. Records show that by the end of the war, over 371,000 German POWs would be held across the United States. Many arrived in 1944, just months before the storming of Normandy. These men came from shattered divisions, pulled out of battlefields in North Africa, Italy, and France. They carried scars, some physical, others ideological. The Reich had drilled into them. America was decadent, weak, a land of mongrels. Yet here they stood, guarded but not beaten, processed by clerks who stamped cards with quiet efficiency. One prisoner, later interviewed in Germany, recalled his first impression. "We braced for hunger and beatings. Instead, they gave us soap and bread." His voice trembled decades later, still marked by the shock of that contrast. We marty, dusk fell. The men were marched toward low barracks. The gravel crunched louder in the silence. Inside, the beds were rough, but the blankets were clean. The guards barked rules: lights out, no talking after 10, but there was no cruelty in their tone. For many, it was the first night since capture where artillery didn't thunder and boots didn't trample over corpses. NBUT, the true dissonance didn't come with the bread or the blankets. It came the next morning, when doors creaked open and sunlight spilled into the compound. The unthinkable happened. And women walked in, NNTHE German prisoners, mouths half open, saw not bayonets, but chalkboards. And that's where the real shock began. May 1944, same camp. The clang of the morning bell still echoed when the prisoners lined up, their boots dragging in the gravel yard. They expected roll call, maybe a work detail. Instead, a door creaked open, and 3 women stepped forward, skirts brushing against the dust, carrying chalkboards and slim books. For a moment, even the guards shifted awkwardly, as if this scene did not belong to war. NNTHE Germans stared. In the Reich, contact with enemy women was unthinkable, punishable. Yet here, in captivity, Americans marched women right into their compound. The women spoke briskly, voices clear, almost casual. "Good morning. Today we begin." One prisoner later wrote in a diary, later recovered by censors, "It was not soldiers, but women. Our officers would never allow this." In NBY 1945, records show over 700 camps across the U.S. employed local civilians, often women teachers, sometimes farmers' wives, to provide basic English instruction. Part of it was practical. Many POWs would be sent to work details in fields, factories, or sawmills. Knowing commands like shovel, carry, or stack saved time. But for the prisoners, the sight carried deeper shock. They whispered behind clenched teeth. Some smirked nervously, others looked down in shame. One young guard scribbled in his report, "Men visibly unsettled by presence of women, especially in authority role." The dynamic cut at Nazi indoctrination, where women were seen as subordinate. Now a young American woman held chalk like a baton of command, and an THE lesson began awkwardly. The women wrote on the board, "I am, you are, we are." The prisoners repeated, halting, their German accents thick, consonants grinding like tank gears. Chalk dust filled the air. Some laughed at their own mistakes. Others scowled in silence. The guards leaned against posts, watching, arms crossed, equally unsure what to make of this strange classroom inside barbed wire. Beneath the surface, something began shifting. Prisoners who had expected punishment were instead being taught, not beaten. The chalkboards carried more than grammar. They carried cognitive dissonance, a crack in the wall of propaganda. And in that small wooden hut, humiliation mixed with curiosity, because learning the enemy's words felt dangerously close to surrender. And yet, surrender was already beginning to take a new shape, one that would soon echo in every chalk mark and every stumbling verb. June 1944. Inside the barrack-turned classroom, the chalk squeaked again. The phrase on the board now read, "I was, you were, we were." The German prisoners sat stiffly on benches, arms crossed, some refusing to speak. Others mouthed the words reluctantly, voices rough with embarrassment. One guard noted in his log, "Men resentful, but repeating." The irony was impossible to miss. Soldiers who once shouted orders in occupied towns now stumbled through the simplest English verbs. Women instructors moved methodically, repeating each phrase with patience. A prisoner with a scarred cheek tried to copy her pronunciation, tongue clumsy against the foreign vowels. Laughter broke out at his mistakes. The woman only smiled, correcting him again. That smile was its own quiet power. Every word spoken forced the men to confront not just grammar, but a new hierarchy. Red Cross reports confirm that by late 1944, roughly 30% of German POWs enrolled in educational programs, English being the most common subject. Officials justified it as preparation for repatriation, to, quote, improve reintegration and reduce idle tensions. But for the prisoners, it landed like a small act of defeat. To learn the language of their captors was to admit dependence, and one recalled years later, to speak their language felt like surrender. Yet the structure of lessons made them persist. Verbs conjugated, nouns labeled, even simple phrases like "thank you" drilled into their heads. And while some resisted, others leaned forward, eager, notebooks filling with shaky handwriting. In those moments, identity blurred. Soldier, student, captive, all in one. Sensory details clung to memory. Chalk dust in the air, pencil stubs scratching, the rhythmic repetition of verbs echoing against wooden beams. Outside, guards smoked by the fence, the thud of baseball bats in the recreation yard bleeding faintly into the classroom. Inside, time slowed to the cadence of English grammar. NNFOR the Americans. It was a pragmatic program. For the Germans, it was dissonance. They had been told the Allies were barbaric, yet here women corrected them gently, as if they were schoolboys rather than enemies. The chalkboards became quiet battlegrounds. Each sentence drilled a tiny surrender that propaganda could not erase. And slowly, something began to shift. Curiosity crept in where resentment once sat. One prisoner dared to raise his hand, asking the English word for bread. And that hunger for food, for language, was about to collide in the mess hall itself. July 1944. The barrack windows rattled faintly as summer heat pressed down, flies buzzing against glass. Inside, the chalkboard still bore yesterday's lesson: bread, butter, meat. A young instructor tapped the board, repeating the words slowly. The Germans echoed her reluctantly. But one prisoner hesitated, the word bread sticking in his throat. For years, Goebbels' speeches had thundered through radios, branding Americans as greedy, decadent parasites. And yet, here was an American woman teaching him their word for survival, without malice. Contradiction tore at them. Nazi propaganda demanded hatred, demanded certainty. But captivity was forcing something else: doubt. Letters later intercepted by censors reveal the cracks. Over 2,000 pieces of correspondence from POWs mention unexpected kindness or treatment better than expected. One line scratched in clumsy English read simply, "They are not monsters. NTHE women teachers understood the tension. They kept lessons simple, repetitive, almost mechanical. But every correction, every gentle nod, carried a message more subversive than any leaflet dropped on a battlefield." For German soldiers raised on rigid hierarchy, the sight of women calmly instructing them was disorienting. One later admitted, "Our officers would never allow this." In that classroom, the Nazi order crumbled word by word. NNTHE sensory dissonance sharpened the memory. Chalk clicking against slate, the faint rustle of skirts, the smell of soap and paper mingling with sweat. Outside the wire, America's abundance hummed. Fields green with corn, towns lit with neon. Inside, prisoners muttered verbs, each syllable tugging them further from the Reich's myths. Yet the most powerful blow came not from words, but from consistency. The teachers showed up daily, unarmed, unafraid. To men trained to see enemies everywhere, this calm routine felt surreal. It was not weakness, it was order of a different kind. One guard captured it in his log. Propaganda dies slower than men, but every class chips at it. And those chips grew larger when the lessons spilled into daily life, when the chalkboard phrases matched the food steaming in the mess hall trays. Because soon, bread would no longer be just a word written in chalk. It would be the taste of warm rations, far richer than anything the Wehrmacht had given them. August 1944. Noon whistle. The line of prisoners shuffled toward the camp mess hall, stomachs tight with both hunger and suspicion. The smell hit first. Roasted meat, boiled potatoes, bread baking in iron ovens. For men who had survived on thin Wehrmacht rations of black bread and watery soup, the aroma was a shock, more piercing than any guard's shout and trays, clattered against metal counters. Steam rose in curls. The German soldiers watched as American cooks, some of them barely older than the prisoners, heaped generous portions onto their plates. One prisoner whispered in disbelief, "More meat than a week in France." The guards ignored the comment, focused only on keeping order. Statistics confirm the contrast. Average American POW rations ran around 200 calories per day, nearly double what many Wehrmacht soldiers received by 1944. Often under 500 calories at the front. The numbers alone tell a story, but for the men in line that day, it was visceral. Their bellies ached with the sudden abundance. One remembered decades later, "We ate better in captivity than we had in uniform." Another wrote in a censored letter, "It is shameful. Our enemies feed us better than our own." That shame was part of the shock. Every bite reminded them of the Reich's failing promises. NTHE sensory details burned into memory. Butter melting across thick bread, the clink of spoons against metal trays, the sweetness of canned peaches dripping down chins. Some men ate in silence, eyes down. Others laughed nervously, unable to mask relief. Guards noted the transformation. Shoulders relaxed, voices lifted. For a moment, the war felt distant. NNBUT, the biggest jolt came when the English lessons crept into the cafeteria. One teacher, standing near the tables, encouraged prisoners to practice. "Bread," she pointed, smiling. "Butter, meat." A few men repeated, hesitant, chewing as they spoke. The simple act of asking for more bread, please, became a strange ritual of surrender and learning combined. It was in these mealtime lessons that propaganda collapsed fastest. No speech from Berlin could erase the taste of white bread handed freely by the enemy. No poster could outweigh the weight of a second helping. And soon those new words traveled further, scratched into censored letters, smuggled into lines sent home to mothers, wives, and children, because the food fed more than hunger. It fed a language. September 1944. The mess hall buzzed with the scrape of benches, trays clattering against wood, the low hum of German voices blending with bursts of English syllables. At the far end, a teacher leaned over a group of prisoners, pointing to their plates. "Bread?" she said firmly, tapping the loaf. The men repeated, some stumbling, others amused. "Butter." The word rolled out awkwardly, softened by laughter. At first, it was just survival, asking for food in the enemy's language. But repetition turned it into something more. A prisoner who once sneered at the thought of English now found himself saying "please" as he reached for a ladle of potatoes. A guard, overhearing, jotted in his log. Men increasingly use English words during meals. Archival reports show that in dozens of camps, mealtime was used deliberately as immersion. Food vocabulary became the first bridge. Bread, meat, coffee, sugar. Simple, but powerful. A Red Cross observer noted, "The act of eating while learning builds strange familiarity." That familiarity chipped at Wall's ideology had built for years. NNTHE sensory clash sharpened the experience. Steam fogged the windows. Butter smeared across fingers as German accents mangled English words. Forks tapped against tin trays as prisoners tested new phrases, almost like children in school cafeterias back home. One remembered later. Each bite carried a word. Some resisted, refusing to utter the language, glaring at classmates who joined in. But hunger often broke pride. A man who refused to say coffee in English found his portion delayed. Within days he muttered it under his breath, cheeks burning, but cup filled. Small humiliations, small victories, depending on perspective. And in FOR, the women instructors. The cafeteria was their quiet strategy. The rhythm of meals gave structure, language attached to taste, smell, repetition. Food makes the words stick, one noted in a post-war report. It worked. By late 1944, camp records show hundreds of prisoners regularly using English at tables, some even joking in mixed phrases, half German, half English. And in BUT, the shock didn't stop at the cafeteria door. The new vocabulary slipped into letters home, scrawled awkwardly across censored paper. Prisoners wanted to prove they were learning. They wanted to show survival. And those letters, clumsy, half English, half German, would carry the dissonance straight across the Atlantic into the hands of their families. October 1944. The camp's censor office smelled of ink and tobacco. Stacks of envelopes piled on desks, each one slit open, every word scanned before it could travel across the Atlantic. Guards sat with magnifying glasses, red pencils poised, crossing out phrases deemed suspicious. Among the bundles were clumsy sentences scrawled in broken English. "I am good." "I have bread." "I learn English." NFOR, the German prisoners. Letter writing was both lifeline and torment. Once a week, they were given paper, stubs of pencils, and a strict word limit. Most wrote to mothers or wives, describing health, food, and weather. But something new appeared in autumn 1944, attempts at English. One prisoner, his script uneven, wrote, "Mother, I am learning their tongue." NNTHE act was dangerous. The Reich discouraged cultural contamination. Yet the letters kept slipping out, monitored, but still delivered. Estimates suggest millions of POW letters crossed the censor's desk, and among them, thousands bore fragments of English words. For the recipients back in Germany, it was bewildering. Their sons, who should have embodied Nazi defiance, were writing in the enemy's language. NNTHE tension was sharp. Some prisoners used English to signal obedience, hoping for lighter treatment. Others used it as quiet rebellion against their own regime, a subtle way of saying, "We see the truth." Censors underlined these phrases in red, archiving them as evidence of psychological shift. One log noted, Men increasingly experiment with English in family correspondence. NNTHE letters carried sensory weight, ink blots spreading across thin paper, the scratch of pencil on wood desks, the heavy silence of men composing thoughts under watchful eyes. Some folded their shame into the lines, "Better food here than home." Others masked it with sarcasm, joking that English words stuck like stones. NFOR guards, the letters were proof the program worked. For the prisoners, each sentence deepened the contradiction. They were soldiers of the Reich, but their families now read fragments of a foreign language, foreign kindness, foreign food. And the clash grew sharper when language met rhythm. The camp radios, switched on for recreation, soon broadcast music, swing, jazz, Glenn Miller's steady beat. Prisoners began scribbling lyrics in their notebooks, copying phrases they didn't fully understand. English was no longer confined to chalkboards or mess halls. It was now carried by melody, slipping past offenses more easily than grammar ever could. November 1944. Evening rolled across the camp, the wire fences casting long shadows. From the recreation hall, a crackle of radio static broke the monotony. Then, brass horns cut through, smooth and bold. Glenn Miller's orchestra, in the mood, swung into the barracks like a foreign wind. German prisoners froze mid-step. Some scowled, others grinned in spite of themselves. NTHE rhythm was irresistible. Feet tapped against wooden floors, fingers drummed on tin cups. And then came the words. Clear, playful, repeated in chorus. "I got a gal in Kalamazoo." The Germans whispered the lines, testing unfamiliar syllables, their accents heavy, vowels bent but alive. A guard scribbled in his report, "Men attempt to sing along in broken English." Music was more than entertainment, it was immersion. Army records show that by late 1944, over 50 camps hosted musical clubs or radio listening nights, often allowing POWs to borrow sheet music. Lyrics became textbooks. Prisoners copied lines into their notebooks, not for exams, but for memory. One later recalled, "Their music forced their words into our mouths." NNTHE sensory impact was unforgettable. The hiss of vinyl, the thump of bass, prisoners, voices blending with swing rhythms. The contrast cut deep. Nazi Germany had banned jazz as degenerate. Now the so-called enemy danced words into their heads with brass and drums. Ideology collided with melody, and melody often won. Some prisoners resisted fiercely. Hardcore Nazis mocked classmates who hummed swing tunes, calling them weak. One barrack saw a brawl erupt when a man sang English lyrics too loudly. Records list dozens of such altercations, proof of the psychological tug-of-war. But the songs persisted. They spread through humming in work details, through whistling on long walks to fields. English was no longer just grammar on chalkboards. It was rhythm, laughter, even joy. NNFOR, the women teachers, the music was an ally. They encouraged men to write down phrases from songs, correcting pronunciation gently. Moonlight, train, baby. The vocabulary was hardly military, yet it stuck deeper than textbooks ever could. Words carried by melody bypassed pride, cutting straight to memory. And soon, that very stickiness of English sparked conflict, because not every man was willing to let go of his old identity, and the ridicule from comrades grew sharper with every sung phrase. December 1944. The barracks air was thick, with smoke from ration cigarettes, the radio still faintly humming from the recreation hall. A few prisoners quietly sang the chorus of "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree," their German accents twisting the rhythm. But across the room, scowls hardened. A tall sergeant, still loyal to the Reich, barked, "Genug, enough." He slammed his fist into the table. Silence fell. Knockery followed quickly. Men who attempted English were called Amikafare, American bugs. In some camps, it turned violent. U.S. Army records list dozens of incidents where pro-Nazi prisoners intimidated or even assaulted classmates who leaned too eagerly into English or American habits. One report described a man beaten after he sang a jazz lyric in his bunk. His crime: speaking the enemy's tongue with too much comfort. NTHE conflict revealed a deeper struggle. For many POWs, learning English felt like survival, even curiosity. For others, it was betrayal. Nazi propaganda had drilled into them that to adopt enemy culture was treason. The women teachers saw it daily. Some men leaned forward, asking for corrections. Others sat stone-faced, refusing to utter a syllable, whispering "traitor" under their breath at classmates. NNTHE atmosphere in these classrooms was volatile. Chalk scraped, laughter burst, then froze as glares cut through. One diary entry captured the tension. To speak English meant forgetting Germany. That was the fear. That language carried not just words but allegiance. Sensory details amplified the divide. The crack of fists against tables, the shuffle of boots in sudden fights, guards rushing in to separate men. A notebook torn in half because it contained English practice lines. In the mess hall, a prisoner who asked for coffee in English was jeered by hardliners until he avoided the word for weeks. And yet, the English lessons did not shrink. They grew. By early 1945, more prisoners attended classes than in the previous year. Some embraced it quietly, practicing at night under blankets, whispering words as if rehearsing a secret. Others clung to German only, retreating into silence. NNTHE resistance showed one thing clearly. English was no longer just language. It was power, identity, even rebellion within the wire. And as vocabulary expanded beyond food and songs into words like factory, ship, and truck, the shock deepened further. Because those words exposed something else: the sheer scale of American industrial strength. January 1945. The blackboard in the drafty classroom bore new words, chalked in big letters: ship, truck, factory, steel. The teacher underlined each one, her voice steady. The prisoners repeated, unevenly, their accents carving the words into jagged sounds. Some smirked. Others frowned, realizing the weight behind those nouns. This wasn't just grammar. It was revelation. NNFOR men who had marched through bombed-out German cities. The idea of endless factories felt unreal. But America's production statistics were staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, U.S. industry launched 2 710 Liberty ships, built over 49,000 Sherman tanks, and produced more than 300,000 aircraft. These numbers circulated through whispered lessons, sometimes written on chalkboards as vocabulary practice. The words themselves, factory, shipyard, assembly line, were proof of an enemy whose power lay not only in guns, but in sheer abundance. One prisoner recalled years later, learning their words was learning their power. Each syllable tied to machinery he could scarcely imagine. When a teacher wrote pipeline on the board and explained it in gestures, men exchanged glances. A single word carried the image of endless fuel snaking across continents, something the Wehrmacht could never match, and NTHE sensory details etched deep. Chalk squeaked, boots scuffed against the floor, while outside the window U.S. supply trucks rumbled past the fence line, their engines drowning out German muttering. Those trucks, convoys without end, embodied what the blackboard spelled. One POW whispered, "Endlos," endless. His comrade only shook his head. NNTHE irony was bitter. Inside the wire, the men were students. Outside, America's war machine moved relentlessly. Learning the vocabulary of abundance forced them to see the war's balance differently. The Reich spoke of destiny, sacrifice, blood. The Americans spoke of steel, trucks, fuel. And steel, trucks, and fuel were winning. Some men resisted harder, arms folded, refusing to recite words like airplane or assembly line. But even they could not ignore the sights. Liberty ships docking at nearby ports, endless trains hauling supplies. Guards occasionally pointed at convoys beyond the wire, repeating English words deliberately, almost tauntingly. Truck, factory. Ship NNFOR the prisoners. The lesson was unavoidable. Language became evidence. The words on chalkboards matched the reality humming just beyond the fence. And soon, those words would leave the classroom altogether, because English became essential outside, on farms, and in factories, where German POWs were sent to labor. February 1945. Dawn frost clung to barbed wire as trucks pulled up outside the camp gates. Guards barked orders. Work details. Dozens of German POWs climbed aboard flatbeds, their breath white in the cold air. Many had learned just enough English to follow the instructions. Sit, move, quiet. Language was no longer abstract. It meant access to food, lighter punishment, smoother days. NNBY 1945, U.S. records show over 425,000 POWs were assigned to labor programs. Farms, sawmills, canneries, road crews. Under the Geneva Convention, they couldn't be used in war industries, but America's vast civilian needs consumed manpower. Prisoners harvested cotton in Texas, cut timber in Wisconsin, picked fruit in California. To work, they needed English: bucket, axe, plow. The chalkboard words came alive in dirt and sweat. One prisoner remembered, English opened the gate to freedom of movement. He meant it literally. Men who understood commands were chosen for outside details, escaping the monotony of barracks. The work could be grueling, but it offered fresh air, glimpses of American life beyond the fences, farmhouses, children on bicycles, women waving from porches. For men raised on tales of American decadence, it was disarming. NNTHE sensory memory was sharp. Frost cracking under boots, the smell of hay in barns, sweat-soaking shirts by midday. Farmers spoke in clipped English. Here, carry, stack. Prisoners stumbled at first, then repeated, words sticking through repetition and labor. Guards noted the shift. Men faster to respond, less hostile, more compliant. Language had become a survival tool. NNBUT. It was more than survival. Work details placed Germans face to face with civilians. A farmer's wife might offer water, saying, "Drink," pointing to a tin cup. The word carved itself into memory. A boy might hand an apple, grinning, teaching, "Thank you." These encounters cut deeper than classrooms or radios. Each gesture wrapped language in humanity. Still, resentment simmered. Some POWs muttered that speaking English in fields was humiliating. Hardliners mocked laborers as collaborators. Yet hunger and fatigue softened resistance. By spring 1945, many men kept small notebooks in their pockets, jotting words learned on farms or in factories, building their own dictionaries of captivity. And among those encounters, one stood out above all others: the unexpected, disarming connection with American women who exchanged more than just commands. They exchanged kindness. March 1945. The sun hung low over an Arkansas farm field where rows of German POWs bent under the weight of cotton sacks. Guards stood at a distance, rifles slung loosely. At midday, a pause was called. The farmer's wife stepped forward, carrying a metal pitcher of water. Her apron was dusted white from flour, her hair pinned back. She poured into tin cups, her voice clear. "Drink." The men hesitated, then repeated the word softly before swallowing. Moments like these unsettled the prisoners more than any guard tower. They had been taught to expect cruelty, yet here, women, wives, daughters, even teenagers, offered them small mercies. A Red Cross inspection noted cases of, quote, female civilians assisting with work details, sometimes teaching basic phrases, thank you, yes, no. For hardened soldiers, these simple lessons struck like lightning. One prisoner admitted later, her smile disarmed me more than any weapon. Reports from 1945 cite fraternization incidents across at least 20 states, some innocent, others scandalous. In one Texas camp, German prisoners exchanged letters with local women, smuggled through sympathetic guards. Most were harmless notes practicing English. I am well. You are kind. Yet each sentence chipped away at the fortress of ideology. NNTHE sensory detail burned deep. Cotton dust filled the air, the creak of wagons, the cool shock of water against parched throats. A woman's voice, soft, firm, carried English phrases the men repeated like catechism. At night in barracks, they whispered those words again, testing them against memory. NNTHE contrast was unbearable for some. To learn from women in captivity felt humiliating, a reversal of every lesson the Reich had taught about dominance and gender. Yet the kindness lingered. One man confessed decades later, it was impossible to hate when they treated us human. NNFOR the women, it was often pragmatic. Communication kept work moving, but the effect on the prisoners was profound. To hear warmth in an enemy's language, to feel compassion in forbidden contact, altered their perception more than rations or radios ever could. And in those fleeting interactions, cups of water, passing apples, small conversations, the seeds of transformation took root. The prisoners began to imagine futures beyond the Reich, futures where English words tied to human faces, not propaganda. NNTHAT quiet transformation soon became explicit. Some prisoners would vow, even in writing, to return to America when the war ended. April 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing. News of Allied armies pushing into the heart of Germany filtered even into the American camps. German POWs lined up for evening roll call, but their minds were elsewhere. Some clutched small notebooks filled with shaky English phrases. Others whispered words they had learned in fields, mess halls, classrooms. For many, the language was no longer just survival. It was a map to another life. And one prisoner wrote in his diary, "In captivity, we saw another future." For him and thousands like him, the experience of food, lessons, and kindness cracked open possibilities unimaginable under the Reich. U.S. records reveal that after the war, thousands of German POWs applied for visas to return to America. Some had met farmers who promised them jobs. Others carried the memory of women who had smiled as they taught thank you or good morning. NNTHE transformation was gradual, almost invisible day to day. But by spring 1945, guards noted changes in demeanor. Fewer saluted Hitler's portrait tacked above bunks. More joined classes voluntarily, even after long work details. English words began slipping into casual conversation between prisoners themselves. Coffee, paper, work. One guard's report read, "Men speak less of Germany, more of America." NNTHE sensory signs of transformation were subtle but telling. A group of prisoners hummed Glenn Miller while repairing fences. Another volunteered to help a teacher carry books. In notebooks, doodles of tanks and eagles gave way to phrases like, "I will go," and "I can work." For men stripped of power, learning became a way to regain agency, not through weapons, but through words. NNNOT. Everyone embraced it. Some still mocked, resisted, or clung to Nazi loyalty. But the tide was clear. Contact with abundance, with civility, with human gestures from civilians, especially women, had shifted perspectives. One man recalled decades later, "The war ended for me not in Berlin, but in an Arkansas classroom." And when the guns finally fell silent, the question grew urgent. What would happen to these transformed men once the barbed wire came down? Would the English they had learned be forgotten, or would it carry them forward? NNTHAT answer came in the final act, repatriation. Men sent home in 1946 carried not just memories of captivity, but the voices of women with chalkboards etched into their futures. May 1946. The war was over. German POWs, gaunt but alive, boarded ships bound for Europe. The clang of chains on gangplanks echoed across American docks. Some men carried nothing but memories. Others clutched notebooks filled with strange fragments. I am, thank you, bread. They were soldiers returning home, yet their baggage was language, kindness, contradictions. Nobren surveys, taken after repatriation, showed that over half of German POWs left with improved English skills. For many, it wasn't fluency, it was fragments. But fragments mattered. A Red Cross officer noted, "Their English may be simple, but the impressions are lasting." Those impressions were not of rifles or punishments, but of women correcting pronunciation, of chalkboards covered in verbs, of food tied to new words. NNTHE return home was disorienting. Families in ruined German towns expected tales of brutality. Instead, some sons described warm meals, clean beds, even jazz music. One diary entry read, "Our enemies fed us better than our Reich." For many Germans, it was the first crack in decades of propaganda. That crack was widened by the fact their sons wrote in English phrases, odd and stilted, but undeniable. NNTHE's sensory contrast lingered. Rubble in Berlin streets versus memories of neat American classrooms. Starvation rations back home against steaming mess hall trays abroad. A prisoner recalled standing in Hamburg ruins, hearing children cry, and whispering to himself in English, "We were in FOR-some." The experience shaped the rest of their lives. Thousands sought to return legally, applying for U.S. visas. Others stayed in Germany but carried English into their professions, teaching, business, rebuilding. And some simply told their children, "The Americans were not what we were told." NTHE most haunting memory was of women with chalkboards. Their presence carried the deepest sting. In captivity, German soldiers had expected fists, humiliation, punishment. Instead, they were taught like schoolboys, corrected gently, treated with a dignity their own officers had often denied them. That reversal dismantled more ideology than any battlefield defeat. One POW put it best decades later. Their language became our bridge, not our chain. He meant that English, learned under guard towers, did not bind him to shame. It opened a path to understanding. And so the legacy of those classrooms lingered long after fences rusted away. Not in textbooks or grand speeches, but in the quiet memory of prisoners stunned by women who turned chalk into a weapon stronger than propaganda.